Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. On the second Wednesday of each month, we discuss the latest bioscience publications. And as a reminder, if you'd like to read more, point your browser to academic.oup.com/bioscience. And just a quick note before today's episode, but at the end of last month, I had the pleasure of attending the American Society for Gravitational and Space Research's annual meeting in Seattle, Washington. It was a great time, and I had a chance to talk with some great researchers about life and physical systems in low gravity and no gravity environments. The meeting was a lot of fun, and we actually wound up with so much great audio that the challenge is really winnowing it down into a single episode. But keep an eye out, that is coming soon. And moving on to today's episode, I was joined by Dr. Dan Gibson-Reinemer, who's a fish biologist with the Illinois Natural History Survey. We talked about the effects of regulation on an unhealthy river system that later became a healthier river system. It was the Illinois Waterway, and it's rebounded significantly since hitting a low point before the passage of the Clean Water Act. I'll let Dr. Gibson-Reinemer tell the story, though, so let's get straight to the interview. Dr. Gibson-Reinemer, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Okay, so in this case, we're talking about an article that begins a lot earlier than a lot of the things we discuss on this show. So I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about the Illinois Waterway, when we first started getting data about it, fish abundance and that sort of thing. When was that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's fortuitous because Stephen Forbes, who was a very pioneering ecologist in America, set up shops on the banks of the Illinois River, near where my current field station is in Havana, Illinois. And that happened in the late 1800s. So he was there because he wanted to study what made the Illinois River so productive in terms of the waterfowl that were there and in terms of the fish that were there. And so he picked a really good spot to study the Illinois River. And we have really outstanding data for the late 1800s that came from this outstanding scientist who was there taking all of these measurements. So it's a very unique situation in that regard.
Okay, and so at that early time, at the end of the century, what was the Illinois River like?
So that's a good question. It was the historic Illinois River at the location where Forbes had set up shops on the lower Illinois River. It's a river it had its valley carved by an ancestral river, sort of a precursor to the Mississippi, if you will. So a very large river was flowing through there tens of thousands of years ago. And then glaciation changed where the Mississippi went. So you have a substantially smaller river in the lower part of the Illinois River flowing through this great valley. And that was one of the keys to understanding why it was so productive, because it has this very expansive valley. When it floods, it floods, and it can be very prolonged in terms of how much flooding that happens. And the Mississippi River itself, when it floods, it can back up the Illinois River, 200 kilometers or so, or at least it could before there were any navigational structures on there. And that really explains a lot of why it was so productive, because it had this prolonged flooding and it had this great floodplain with a lot of resources, and you get to see those connections between the river and these riparian areas.
And I guess I should interrupt us for a moment and just mention that we're talking about the Illinois Waterway, so it's a system of rivers. We're not simply talking about the Illinois River. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that. And when I say the Illinois Waterway, I refer to the Illinois River itself, and then also the Des Plaines River, which flows up. It's one of two rivers that join relatively close to Chicago to form the Illinois River itself.
Okay, so we have this early data collection around 1900, and what kind of things is it showing us in terms of fish abundance?
Well, Forbes was really, I think, initially interested in just figuring out the straight science of what was happening and how it was so productive. But then the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal opened in 1900. And we had this scientist who was very far-sighted, who was very well aware that as this canal was being built and as it was getting ready to send untreated sewage down into the river, that this was going to have a big effect on the river. And he wanted to be able to be there and to monitor these changes that happened right away. So you've got his early measurements and some of his colleagues as well. And you also have some data that we used from commercial fishermen at the time, because there was a highly valuable commercial fishery in the Illinois River in the early part of the 1900s.
And you mentioned the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. When that was implemented, what kind of effects did that have on the abundance of fish and the health of the river?
Yeah, so it had two effects, really, depending on where you were in the river. So the closer you were to where the canal entered the river and up towards the Des Plaines River, one of the most immediate effects was that there's lots of industrial wastewater and untreated sewage entering the river. And so that's a ton of nutrients, lots of nutrients overloading the system. And as those decompose, it decreases the oxygen, sometimes to levels that were near zero. And we know that because people like Forbes are out there actually measuring that during the summer months when oxygen is typically at its lowest levels in these rivers. There were places, for miles and miles downstream where there was essentially no oxygen in the water. And so that just had a devastating effect on anything in the river that required oxygen, that couldn't breathe air. And so we know that had an effect that progressed downstream, further and further each year. But at the same time, we suspect that it had sort of a fertilizing effect if you went very far downstream, so towards the lower Illinois River, because there were some nutrients in there and some extra water that was flowing through there. And that might have had a bit of a fertilizing effect downstream, whereas upstream, it had a very negative effect.
And what sort of effects were they seeing on fish? Obviously you've mentioned these low oxygen hypoxic events. Not good, I would assume.
Yes, they were out there, Forbes and some of his colleagues, in the first few years after the canal opened, and it was basically devoid of a lot of aquatic life, not just fish. And then in terms of the reliable data that we have, there's a bit of a gap until the electrofishing or the sampling of the river, the standardized monitoring that we discussed in the paper, began in the late 1950s. And when that happened, there were some fish up there in the upper part of the river, but virtually all of them were invasive species, particularly two, common carp and goldfish. And even the ones that were there, the carp and the goldfish that could survive, were in really poor condition. They had lesions, they had problems with their eyes. Sometimes their eyes were literally falling out of their sockets. They were fish that were not in good quality whatsoever. And that dissipated, the farther downstream you got. But even so, a lot of the populations of fish throughout the river weren't where they were, a century or several decades before, right around the turn of the century, when there was a highly productive commercial fishery in that river.
And just out of curiosity, those invasive species, were those introduced on purpose, or was that, just people releasing pets, or what kind of thing happened there? Or do we know?
Well, we do know in terms of the common carp that was introduced intentionally. You used to be able to, you could literally write to Congress and request to get some fish eggs you could stock, or some larval fish. And common carp was one of the species that you could stock, and it was encouraged because at the time people enjoyed it. They enjoyed eating it. That is, it's a popular sport fish in Europe to this day. Our taste had changed, but it was initially stocked and it was harvested commercially. And in fact, in the early part of the 20th century, it was introduced, and it quickly became both the most harvested and the most valuable commercial fish in the Illinois River.
Okay, so the situation that we have in the late 50s, I believe you said, is we have the canal and the attendant pollution with that, and we have the introduction of two large invasive species that have had further negative effects on the river system's health. Are there any other things that are causing problems in the river system?
Sure. So the river's changing in some other important ways as well. A lot of the river is being levied, so they're essentially channelizing the river, making it straighter, blocking off the access to the floodplain, and that's to provide better and more reliable farmland in the area around it and to control floods. So that's happening, and that's an important change because it's severing the link between the river and the floodplain that existed historically. Not totally, and not everywhere. It's a change that's happening throughout the river, and it's an important one that really helps explain a lot of the changes that are going on in the river itself. There's also some sedimentation that's occurring primarily as water, wherever humans settle, the soil tends to run off a little bit and go into the river. As that happens, some of these backwaters or the nursery areas for a lot of fish start to fill in and get shallower and shallower because essentially the topsoil is washing into the rivers and then settling in these areas.
Okay, so we've got geological perturbation in addition to invasive species and pollution. Is this the low point for the river?
Yeah, in many ways, I think that first half of the 20th century or so probably was a real low point. I certainly hope it was. In terms of the data that we were taking a look at here, it's hard to get much worse than that. We took a look at what we called sport fish, or that's a useful category because it combines fish that a lot of anglers target, and they're also typically the large predators in these systems. And when we started taking a look at the data from the standardized sampling in the late 50s, early 60s, in the upper parts of the river, there were virtually none of those fish there. So you have a river that's essentially devoid of large predators. The number of species there, species richness is pretty low, and the diversity of species is also quite low. So, for having a river that had fish in it, it was almost as bad as you could get.
Okay, and so I think this low point may be familiar to many listeners of the podcast, but this is a story with a happier ending, or at least a happier next chapter. So what happens next?
Sure. So, and I do want to clarify one thing. When I spoke about the fact that the river was at a real low point, and there was virtually no large predators in there, I should have clarified that I meant only the upper parts of the river, so the areas closest to the canal. Farther downstream, as you get closer to St. Louis and towards the Mississippi, there was always a population, decent populations of sport fish and larger predators in there, but they were at much lower levels even there than they had been before. So the entire river was being affected. It was certainly more severe in the upper river than it was in the lower river. But what we see is that after the passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972, that throughout the river, not just in the upper river, but in the lower river as well, important metrics begin to improve. So the number of species there, species richness, that begins to improve. Species diversity improves, how many species there are and how evenly distributed fishes are among those different species. And then the number of sport fish or larger predators, all of those go up. And most strikingly, in the areas that were most affected, closer to Chicago, these populations of sport fish just came back exponentially. It was an enormous rebound. And today, up in some of those areas, in the upper Illinois River and the Des Plaines River, the catches of those sport fish right now, and the monitoring that continues to this day, are really high. I mean, the highest that we've seen since we began the monitoring. And these are fish in pretty good shape too. So it was really a roaring comeback that these fish made.
And how did the Clean Water Act cause that to happen? I think we're all familiar with the notion that it's passed and that it has certain regulations, but kind of what are the regulations that make it most possible for those species to rebound and water quality to improve?
So in this case, we had a really fortuitous opportunity. Up closer to Chicago, they had to begin doing a better job of treating the water and in the Illinois River. And to do that, they implemented the tunnel and reservoir plan. And that was initiated after the Clean Water Act was passed. It took a while for that to actually come online. It was a fairly huge undertaking in terms of the engineering that went into it. And it didn't, the first part of that became active in about 1983. And at that time, we have some really good water quality data. It's from the Chicago, basically from the Metropolitan Water District up there. And so what one of my co-authors was able to do was to take a look at water quality parameters that were improving as these water treatment systems came online, and how the fish assemblage was changing at the same time. So we were able to pair changing water quality with changing fish assemblages and figure out what was really happening there, what was driving the improvement in these fish populations. And the most important things that they found in that part of the study was that fish improvements were really tightly linked with decreasing ammonia in the water and increasing water clarity and increasing oxygen levels in the water.
Okay, so we have evidence then that if we can improve certain water quality metrics, we can then perhaps expect species that have been negatively affected by pollutants to rebound.
That's right, and I think that generally makes sense. I think a lot of people would expect that. They'd expect that water quality would improve, and they'd expect that fish would improve as a result of that. But it was surprising even for me how quickly and how well they responded. I've worked as a fish biologist with across several different states, and you almost never see changes that are this positive occurring in these natural systems. This was a pretty overwhelming positive change, and it is quite surprising for me, frankly.
So I want to talk more about that. Before we do, I was hoping we could touch just a little bit on some of the sampling methods that are used. You mentioned one of the data sources that you have involves electrofishing, and I was hoping you could just tell us a little bit about that program and kind of how that works.
Sure. Yeah. So electrofishing involves running an electric current through the water, And that works by stunning the fish. And when the fish get stunned, they typically roll over. You see the whites of their bellies, and we can capture them pretty easily. And so the way this program worked is we had a boat, and we have the specifications and the designs of these boats have stayed exactly the same throughout the course of this study. And in terms of the effort that we put in, we standardized how many minutes we sample at each location. And so it's a boat, and it's got these metal probes that hang out the front. And this basically distributes electricity throughout the water. Someone stands up on the bow of the boat, and that's these fish as they're stunned. They're kept in a live well because it doesn't kill them, it just stuns them. So they're kept in a live well on the boat. We measure them, we weigh them, get all kinds of information about them, and then we return them to the water. And what's so helpful in this regard is that the exact same protocols have been followed consistently throughout the course of that study. And so we have a very direct way of comparing what was in the river in the 1950s and 1960s and what's there now, because you've been doing things exactly the same for so long. It's a very highly standardized program. It was pretty unique in terms of being initiated so early. A lot of these long-term ecological monitoring programs haven't been around quite as long. So it's not completely unique, but it's rare to have this type of opportunity. And it makes a really great way to measure something because you have data in the 1950s and 1960s before these water quality improvements happened, and you can compare the fish before and after using the exact same method. So it's a very powerful way to analyze changes in the river.
Yeah, and it seems like, that your work here really points to the value of having longer term data sets and programs that are carried out over a long period of time.
Absolutely. This is really a dream come true for a fish biologist to be able to have this kind of data to look at, because it almost never happens. And not just for fish biologists, for other people as well. It's very rare, no matter what organism you study, to have this kind of standardized data that goes back so long. It's great because it goes back so long, it's so standardized, and it also covers essentially the entire Illinois River and then part of the Des Plaines River as well.
Okay, so what's next for the Illinois Waterway now? I assume it's still being monitored by similar means. Are there threats still being faced? What's on the horizon?
Sure. So it does have, as far as it's come, it has some other threats that are challenging and troubling. Many people might be familiar with the Asian carp or the big-headed carps. There's two species, silver carp and big-headed carp, that have invaded the lower portion of the Illinois River. They're in the Mississippi River as well. And so these are large, fast-growing fish, and they're not present in the uppermost parts of the Illinois River right now. And we're trying to, keep them from getting in there, especially because this canal that I mentioned connects the Illinois River to the Great Lakes. So we want to keep those fish out of the Great Lakes. It's because they take food resources, so zooplankton and phytoplankton, out of the river. They're very efficient at filtering this. They get a lot of the food resources in the river, and they grow very quickly. So an enormous amount of biomass in the lower part of the Illinois River right now is in the form of these invasive carp species. So that's certainly a concern. And it's also concerning because we've seen this great comeback in a lot of the fish in the river. And what we're concerned about is that these new invasive carp species are going to reverse that they're going to lead to decreases in both the quantity and the quantity of native fish and native sport fish in the river.
Oh, and just out of curiosity, what happened to the previously invasive species of carp that were in the river?
That's a great question. And they've declined. So common carp and goldfish have declined dramatically. In some of the most impacted areas, it's a complete reversal. We're in the 50s and 60s, 97% of the species caught were common carp, 97% of the individuals that were caught were common carp, and now only about 2% of the catch up there is common carp. So they've undergone almost a complete reversal. We don't know exactly what's been going on. There's probably been several factors that have contributed to that. One intriguing possibility is that a cyprinid herpes virus, something that only affects common carp, might be present in the river, and that might be causing a lot of these declines in the common carp populations. We'd really like to have some histological samples we could go back and compare over time, but we just don't have those. So precisely what's caused those common carp to decline it's not quite known, but for whatever reason, they haven't disappeared. They're still there, but they're at much lower levels than they were historically, and that's another success that's happened.
Yeah, so regardless of the cause, it's certainly fortuitous. So what's next for your research? Are you continuing with this project, or are you studying other areas?
I still continue to do some work here. Some of my colleagues, in particular, are looking at endocrine disruptors in the river, particularly close to large metropolitan areas. There's a lot of synthetic hormones that are in the water. They typically don't get treated when they go through a water treatment facility. And these can lead to skewed sex ratios, things like male fish producing eggs, and some pretty troubling effects there. So that's one of the ongoing challenges that some of my colleagues are looking into. We're also taking a look at how fish in the Illinois River and then also parts of the Mississippi River are changing from these carp, how this new wave of invasive species is affecting ecological interactions and things like that.
And great, we'll be on the lookout for that research. Dr. Gibson-Reinemer, thank you very much for joining me today.
No, thank you. It's my pleasure.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.